Hey guys, basically I wanted to do a video here and it's going to be kind of loose, but I wanted to talk about the overall effectiveness of the US military after the Second World War because I feel there's this huge misconception that the US military has done very badly. I would say it is a mixed record after the Second World War, but it's not a terrible record. There's this kind of like viewpoint that the United States has lost every single war it's fought since World War II, and that is definitely untrue. It's just kind of a stupid opinion, and I'm not like a burger tart or boomer con American here. I just think that the United States' track record has been tarnished by kind of like Howard Zinn type people into being a very huge failure. While I would say it's probably 60 to 70% of US interventions have been won since World War II. Now, this isn't going to be some really scientific video. I haven't read any books recently on this. This is just from my overall knowledge of just, what I've come to learn through reading over the years. So, bear with me if there's some mild historical inaccuracies here. So the first major U.S. intervention since the Second World War is, of course, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. North Korea and South Korea would have small border conflicts. Both were created out of the collapse of the Empire of Japan, of course, with the Soviet Union sponsoring North Korea and the United States, and I guess you could call them the Western Allied powers sponsoring South Korea. In fact, the reason that this war happened, because you could very well argue that this war didn't need to happen, was because the United States didn't fund the military of South Korea very well. So what ended up happening is the Soviets funded the North Korean military very, very well, and there's this huge lopsided military. So the North had this huge superiority over the South. So, come 1950, the North invades the South. They completely overrun it. The North actually is very well mechanized army, modeled off the Soviet army. The Soviet Union boycotts the United Nations, so the United Nations votes for a intervention against the aggressing North Korea. The United States sends reservists and occupation troops that at this time, until 1951, would still be in Japan, over into South Korea to defend the Pusan perimeter, which is basically the last stronghold of South Korea at this point. The American troops initially do horribly. The North Koreans actually destroy them, but MacArthur eventually becomes the leader of the operation. He lands at Incheon, north of Seoul, routs the North Korean army. By the way, North Korea was going to lose because immense, like unfathomable, immense naval superiority the U.S. had, unfathomable, immense air superiority, and then just gross material superiority. The U.S. by itself had more, but along with the United Nations, along with the United Kingdom, its ally South Korea, Australia, and Turkey and the Philippines, Canada as well, and a bunch of symbolic stuff from NATO and other just random countries like Ethiopia and Colombia, they're able to really overpower North Korea. Then the United Nations, or the Western Allies you could call them, advance all the way to, I think it's the Yalu River on the border of Korea, and they're going to go basically against their mandate and overthrow Korea and forcibly unify them, which from my understanding was against the mandate because they were just supposed to reverse the invasion. And I mean, like, because they're destroying this invading army that invaded out of aggression under the UN mandate. So to conquer and forcibly annex North Korea, and there was a referendum that was supposed to unify it. Like there was a referendum that was supposed to unify the South, and North Korea was going to conquer all of South Korea and have its fake referendum and justify its invasion, right? But anyway, they advanced to the Yalu River. The United States has horrible intelligence, or you could say the UN mandate army has horrible intelligence. China surges in. China is actually doesn't do anywhere near as North Korea did, at least during the initial stages. At this point, the North Korean army is basically annihilated. So the Chinese sweep in across from the Yalu River, massively outnumber the UN forces, and push them back with immense casualties. A very Pyrrhic victory. Back not as far as the Pusan perimeter, but they're able to take back Seoul. Then MacArthur asked Truman, who was the president at the time, that the United States should be able to call upon the Republic of China, now Taiwan people will call them, but at that time were just recently removed from mainland China, Republic of China, to help intervene and to use bombing raids within to blockade. So they want to bomb the cities directly, strategically bomb Chinese cities, especially in Manchuria, and be able to destroy the air bases that were in Manchuria that are technically being run by the Soviet Air Force. Because the Soviet Air Force is flying in shorties, there isn't really a Chinese Air Force. Sort of covertly with North Korean and Chinese flags on them, but everybody knows they're Soviets. So the Soviet Air Force be able to bomb the Soviet Air Force, be able to bomb Chinese strategic targets, be able to navally blockade all of China, and to allow Republic of Chinese soldiers into the Korean Peninsula to help intervene. Truman very publicly disagrees with MacArthur, and MacArthur is directly fired and replaced with Ringway. Ringway uses the massive material superiority of the UN, creates Ringway's meat grinder, pushes them back up to the 38th parallel. And then from the summer of 1951 until the armistice, so smart, the peace treaty, and my tongue's all tied. My sinuses are all fucked up by allergies. Maybe I do have Corona Chan right now. But until 1953, they have the peace treaty, which has lasted more or less to this day, but we'll get back because there's really actually a Second Korean War people don't talk about in the 60s, but we'll get back to that in a few minutes. So personally, some people will say that this is a U.S. defeat because South Korea didn't conquer North Korea and unify the whole country under the Republic of Korea. In my opinion, this is a kind of a mild victory for the United States, because at the beginning of the war, before U.S. intervention, South Korea was very desperate, almost lost. The United States intervened, and South Korea regained all of its territory, or the vast majority of its territory, and took some North Korean territory. The initial lines of the war and the lines now somewhat are slightly better for South Korea. And the United States and South Korea took much less casualties, at least military casualties, than China did, who took immense military casualties due to the UN's material superiority with aircraft and artillery. So, in my opinion, that is definitely a U.S. victory. Well, now let's go to 1958 in Lebanon. Lebanese politics is the most complex thing in the history of the human race. But in 1958, it looked like, very, very basically, there was going to be a civil war between the Christians and the Muslims. So, President Eisenhower at the time occupied Beirut until the crisis ended through negotiations. And I'm really focusing on not like airstrikes, that kind of thing. I'm really focusing on events where the U.S. directly sent in troops. So this one's really borderline, but it definitely is a U.S. military success. Okay, so let's pass over to the beginning of President Kennedy's administration. We're going to talk about the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was a U.S.-sponsored invasion of Cuban exiles to attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro following his revolution, and this would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Caribbean Crisis, if you want to call it that. Is that 62? Because Bay of Pigs is like 61. Boomer time. Anyway, so the Bay of Pigs was a failure, and the U.S. blockade of From the Soviet point of view, it's a failure, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So obviously this one is a U.S. military failure. And what you're going to see along here in every one of these interventions which had clear goals are almost always successful. Interventions do not have clear goals are almost universally a failure. And that's just kind of a truism along all military operations. The more hastily something is thrown together, the more likely it is to fail. And the better something is planned, even if it's against odds, it has bad odds, it's probably going to succeed. Organization is probably more important than tactics, material, or anything else in modern warfare. So now let's talk about the big boy in the room, the most major U.S. conflict since the Second World War. We're talking about, of course, the Vietnam War. And, the U.S. pretty much wanted to get sucked in this war. So after the whole French-Vietnamese War, the French-Indo-Chinese War, ended and France withdrew and you had the peace treaty, Ho Chi Minh, of course, started destabilizing the South. The United States backed the South, the Soviet Union and China, even though they're in the middle of the Sino-Soviet split, back the North. The United States gradually gave more support to South Vietnam, but as well Laos, the Kingdom of Laos, and the Kingdom of Cambodia. And there's so much historiography that's spilled, and we don't truly know the real extent of the CIA's involvement in the Diem, you could call it dynasty, Diem regime. A lot of people say the Diem was a horrible monster, Rage Against the Machine, and has the Buddhist monk that's burning himself. Diem and his family were the direct leaders of South Korea. He had a brother that was the head of the intelligence, and he had another brother that was quasi head of the Catholic Church in Vietnam, who ended up becoming the source of most of the Episcopal consecrations instead of Vacantism. And I'm going to do a video on that later because that's some really interesting stuff. But anyway, the Diem family was firmly in control, but they were Catholic. So you could compare them to, say, something like the Assad family in modern Syria, who are Alawite, the small majority religion, closely knit, very educated, who's exercising power over a different religion's masses. And, is authoritarian, but is pushing that country forwards technologically, but not necessarily very popular. So Diem was like a 1950s, 1960s version of the Assad family. But what happened is that he was overthrown in a coup d'etat in 1963. And following that, the South Korean military took direct control because Diem technically was a civilian leader who had close ties to the military, and his brother controlled the intelligence network. But following that, the South Korean government was just a complete shit show, and it was run by a succession of military coups and bad generals who didn't know what they were doing. And North Vietnam took advantage of this and started sending more and more Viet Cong after this coup into South Vietnam, until the United States directly intervened after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is, not exactly the most real incident. Let's just put it like that. And the U.S. gets directly involved in South Vietnam, but they're not allowed to attack the aggressor, North Vietnam, so they're just kind of sitting there like it's some kind of like horde mode in Gears of War or, Nazi zombies or something. And they're just fighting Viet Cong that are being directly trained by North Vietnam, or are soldiers that are walking across the border into South Vietnam and are into South Vietnam from North Vietnam, but more likely through the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia, and attacking the South Vietnamese and the American troops that are helping them, as well as South Korean and Australian troops there too, which a lot of people forget. So anyway, they're harassing all these troops. The U.S. is mounting massive casualties, But the war, because of the U.S. intervention, is rapidly spreading and proving the domino theory of if one person becomes communist in a region, one state becomes communist, all the states in the region will become communist. So the Pathet Lao, directly allied and basically a puppet of the North Vietnamese, get support and starting to win in Laos just as much as the Khmer Rouge, which are allied, but definitely not a puppet because they'll go to war later in Cambodia, are fighting the Kingdom of Cambodia. So anyway, everybody knows that the U.S. had no idea what it was doing. The CIA probably did topple the Diem regime. We don't know 100%, but that's probably what happened. They toppled the Diem regime so that they could directly control South Korea, and that stabilized, I keep saying Korea, but that very destabilized South Vietnam, and that led to a situation where the U.S. couldn't win at least what it was trying to do, and the U.S. had a horrible, no planning whatsoever. They did not have any operational plan. And the thing is, the U.S. could have very easily won, right? They could have bombed the dams, flooded the Mekong Delta, and just annihilated North Vietnam. And they could have done technically what they did in the Korean War, right? They could attempt to reinvade North Vietnam. But they didn't do that. They're very leisurely. They weren't really trying to win. And that's something that people really forget. They really thought that they could just kill all these North Vietnamese. And definitely, the U.S. is taking somewhat moderately high casualties there. I mean, 60,000 soldiers seems like a lot, but it's very, very low. I think more Roman soldiers died at Kanye, or whatever, in the Pyrrhic Wars than died in Vietnam. But the war becomes very unpopular because of how badly it's being waged, and it ends up lasting. The U.S. ends up being there till 1973. Johnson, who begins the war, definitely has no idea what he's doing. He was going to lose the election in a landslide, so he doesn't run for re-election. And then Nixon comes in. Nixon starts to very, very slowly withdraw. He starts bombing civilian targets in the north as well as bombing the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge so that South Vietnam could basically stand on its own. And there's something that I think a lot of conservatives have gone after what Nixon did, is they'll say, Nixon would have won the war. Nixon won the war, and then he got impeached, and then they lost the war. I'm pretty sure that Nixon knew that South Vietnam was going to lose without direct intervention at that point. It was just, there was basically a Cold War in between the Sino-Soviet split. There was a Cold War in between China and the Soviet Union, where they're pushing as much support as they can into North Vietnam. If the U.S. pulls out its support of South Vietnam, they're going to lose no matter what. But I think what Nixon was trying to do is withdraw U.S. troops, give South Vietnam enough support so that they can win the war past Nixon's term, probably into the next president's term, who, honestly, if Nixon served out his term, it probably would have been Ronald Reagan at that point. Because I don't think Carter could have won without Nixon being impeached at Watergate. But anyway, say Nixon doesn't get impeached at Watergate. He didn't actually get impeached. He resigns because he thinks he's going to get impeached, but he probably wouldn't at this point because Trump obviously didn't get impeached and Clinton didn't get impeached. So even despite how bad his polls were at Watergate, he probably could have survived impeachment if we look in retrospect. So anyway, say Nixon stays in, say he's able to directly support South Vietnam longer, we probably would have seen the collapse of South Vietnam in the late 70s, in the 80s. But anyway, when the U.S. pulls out of South Vietnam, they pull everything out, all support, not just military support. And that's what leads to the collapse in Laos and the collapse in Cambodia that leads to the Pathet Lao taking over Laos and the Khmer Rouge taking over Cambodia. And the U.S. So, leftists will say the U.S. is responsible for the Khmer Rouge genocide. It's not a genocide, in my opinion. So let's start genocide explaining the Khmer Rouge like I'm fucking Noam Chomsky right now. So the Khmer Rouge basically went total autarky. The United States pulled out all support for Cambodia, leading to Khmer Rouge winning. Khmer Rouge immediately pull out complete and absolute autarky. And that was because really the capital of Cambodia at that point was basically the only thing that the Kingdom of Cambodia controlled at the very end of that civil war. And the Khmer Rouge controlled all the countryside, which meant that there were, I think, in a country of like 8 million people at the time, there were over 1 million refugees, homeless farmers that were living in the city. So Cambodia expels them out to the countryside. All trade with the U.S. breaks down. China's in complete chaos. China's the only ally of the Khmer Rouge. China's the only country that can support them, but China's going through the Cultural Revolution in complete chaos. Its agricultural system's garbage anyway, so a famine develops in Cambodia. Anyway, South Vietnam collapses, conquered. The Pathet Lao win in Laos, and the Khmer Rouge win in Cambodia. Resounding defeat. Obviously, everybody knows this. But the United States, as I said, technically, if it wanted to kill way more people, could have destroyed the Mekong Delta, or it could have invaded North Vietnam itself, and possibly led to a second Korean War or even a nuclear war with China. But the U.S. never had a clear plan or a clear path for victory. That's the takeaway here. And the U.S. could have backed Diem, but they probably didn't. They probably actually allowed Diem to be assassinated. They at least let it happen, but they probably directly worked together with the conspirators and led to the overthrow of Diem, which probably delegitimized South Vietnam and made any victory impossible. Okay, you guys, it's time to move on to the Second Korean War. Something a lot of people forget about is in 1966 to 1969, North Korea and South Korea had a border war along the DMZ, where North Korea attempted to reunite the country by destabilizing it and using terrorism and other unconventional means. So they generally fought a border war and would sneak soldiers along the DMZ and attack the South. The most famous incident of this border war was, of course, the Blue House Raid, where they sent their special forces units in an attempt to kill the then president Park Chung-hee, who was probably one of the most successful presidents of the 20th century, or leaders of the 20th century, the leader of South Korea at the time. Just a pretty, like a small border war. But, I mean, South Korean borders were maintained, so U.S. victory. So let's fast forward to 1965. Dominican Republic coup d'etat, Dominican Republic Civil War, what you want to call it. So anyway, the founder of what is he? Juan Bosch, the founder of the Dominican Revolutionary Party. The U.S. feared that he would be another Castro, sends the 82nd Division in, topples him, and, reestablishes a dictatorship which will support the United States. Classic U.S. intervention in Latin America, prompted, more intensified by the Cold War and the fear of another Castro, which could harbor Soviet troops or Soviet military to help the Soviet Union. And Castro got, economic aid from the Soviet Union, was able to trade with the Soviet Union out of it just as well. So let's go back to the Lebanese Civil War. So throughout the 1980s and going into the 1990s, and it ends up being occupied until the 2000s, was the Lebanese Civil War. Israel attempts to chase the PLO out of Lebanon and invades Lebanon. Syria comes in, occupies the north. Israel occupies the south. And then the U.S. and Italy, France, and Britain attempt to become a multinational force for peace under the United Nations. And it fails spectacularly. Definitely a U.S. failure. Doesn't go anywhere. A U.S. embassy ends up being bombed. U.S. embassies from that point on are known to be easy targets, generally, you could say, and get attacked from that point on. Definitely a U.S. failure. So let's go into the invasion of Grenada. Hudson Austin becomes the military dictator of Grenada, and he's allied to the Cubans. So I don't want to talk too excessively about this. But, so Reagan drums up this... I guess maybe I'm following this in line. But anyway, they're very afraid because Grenada, which is a very small, insignificant country, Cuba, which has actually helped Angolan communists harassing South Africa, and they import African immigrants, and it's just really weird, their communism. But they're used by the Soviet Union not to be a direct spearhead. The same way that the Soviet Union won't directly send aid to people, it'll send it through the Czech Republic or the Czechoslovakia and stuff like that. So they'll send weapons through Czechoslovakia. Well, the Soviet Union actually would have Cuba be its little proxy warrior. So then they'd have Cubans do their dirty work so that the Soviet Union doesn't appear to be more of an aggressor in the world stage. And Cuba gets to be the forefront of communist revolution worldwide, or at least in Africa and here in Grenada. So anyway, Grenadans become allied with Cuba. They're supposed to be building this Air Force base, and the U.S. sends a small detachment in, overthrows the government, and establishes their own pro-U.S. government in Grenada, and they restore the constitutional government. So this is a resounding, very small country, but a very feel-good victory that helps Ronald Reagan. And you can tell Ronald Reagan, when he intervened on the whole Vietnam debacle, Ronald Reagan picked targets that would succeed, and if they didn't, they Lebanon, it doesn't really lead to that much burn back in the United States. Sure, the embassy got blown up, but he's no George W. Bush, and you're gonna see this later with Clinton and with Bush. They're very Bush the first. We're gonna see that they're very picky. They pick their battles that they know that they'll win. And Obama definitely doesn't pick his battles you know he'll win, and Bush the second definitely doesn't pick battles you know he'll win. But Reagan knew that he'd win in Grenada, and he knew it didn't really matter what he did in Lebanon with his peacekeeping force. He bombs, supposedly Gaddafi bombed a discotheque in West Germany. They killed U.S. soldiers, so he does these little actions to where he bombs Gaddafi in Libya, bombs an airbase or an air base, right? And then he attempts to assassinate Gaddafi, and he kills his kids and stuff. So just very, very small stuff. And then now you go into the first Bush presidency after Reagan. This 12 years where the Republicans control the presidency, and they have a shuffling control of the Senate or the House, and they do nothing on this massive immigration thing that Johnson did. This alt-right talking point that just happens to be true. So anyway, Bush, Manuel Noriega does a bunch of Bush stuff that Bush doesn't like, and he's part of the Colombian drug cartel. Colombia is a very weak country, very small country the U.S. can directly intervene with, and Bush can, show off the power of the United States, especially in the midst of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline of the Eastern Bloc in 1990, December 1989. So he does a classic regime transfer in Panama. Very small war, huge victory, very good operationally, and again, very successful. And we're going to go, because Bush did the Panama invasion, and then he did the Gulf War. So we're going to go into the Gulf War. Everybody knows... Well, we should go back a little bit. So you have the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The U.S. hostages are taken. Carter attempts to rescue them. And then that obviously failed. The helicopters get all shot down. And then Reagan and Bush do backdoor negotiations, and they're released as soon as Reagan comes to office. And the United States has its revenge, and the Soviet Union as well has its revenge by both of them at the same time. And I think China did too, and all of NATO support Saddam's invasion into Iran, sorry. My tongue is getting tied really bad in this, but you guys, I hope it comes across I know what I'm talking about. Saddam Hussein invades Iran. He invades Khuzestan. My tongue is tied really bad. So Saddam invades Khuzestan, but he attempts to invade all of Iran simultaneously. He is a classic Arab leader who has very poor standing of like organization, just operational. Like he's not planning anything. He just invades bluntly across the border, and Iran didn't have very good like mixed forces. Like they didn't have a very good army really. So Saddam's invading with all these tanks and artillery, but he doesn't have an air force. But Iran has an air force. So Iran uses its air force that the Shah got from the United States, breaks down the Iraqi army, halfway through this invasion of Khuzestan, which is the Arab part of Iran, and the part that has most of the oil. And then they get into this trench war stalemate. Iran almost wins numerous times, and the whole entire world is against Iran, supports Iraq. And basically, it gets down to these tanker wars where the United States intervenes, because this definitely, in my book, is a huge U.S. intervention. So it gets in this tanker war where basically, like Germany in World War I, Iran attempts to control the tankers coming out of Iraq and Kuwait to a certain extent, right? And they're trying to cut off Iraq's oil to crash the Iraqi economy. The U.S. doesn't take that, starts attacking and harassing the Iranian Navy. And, this is a conspiracy theory, but the U.S. shoots down an Iranian civilian jet and it blows up Iranian oil rigs, right? So Iran is not doing good. The U.S. is showing very hard support for Iraq. Iraq builds up, I think, one of the biggest standing armies in the history of the world at this stage. Invades, takes back the territory that Iran took because Iran, I think from 81 or 82 until 88 was winning the war. And then Iraq, with massive support from the West and to a certain extent the Soviet Union, reinvades the parts of Iran that they've taken over because Iran had much better tactics, but Iraq always had material superiority. So the Iraqis push the Iranian invasion back out of Iran, and they come to the table in a peace treaty. But the problem is Iraq has this massive standing army and an immense debt. So at the same time, Kuwait is leaching its oil from underneath Iraq. So Iraq invades Kuwait, who to a certain extent is an artificial country created by the British. Iraq is a little bit of an artificial country, Mesopotamia, but Kuwait's a pretty artificial country created by the British, which is a lot richer and liked by the West, unlike Iraq. So Iraq invades, sets up a puppet regime, even though it also apparently has territorial claims with Kuwait. And then the U.S. is like, no, because this is part of the Carter policy, which you don't learn about in U.S. history that much. The Carter policy, which Reagan obviously did intervene in the Iran-Iraq war, is that Persian Gulf oil, if it is ever cut off, the United States will intervene directly and go to war with whoever's cutting off. Now, that even mean the Soviet Union in the Cold War or China today. So U.S. official policy, this is part of the petrodollar theory, is the United States will directly intervene and keep the lanes of the Persian Gulf open. So anyway, because Iraq invades Kuwait, the United States does the Carter policy, or what is it? Here, I'll pause for a second for my boomer moments. The Carter Doctrine. The United States goes the Carter Doctrine and intervenes on the side of Kuwait. They say that Saddam could invade Saudi Arabia and start Operation Desert Shield while they fish the UN to get support and build a massive coalition which will be popular throughout the Arab world and NATO for these little token allies. And Saddam, who's a complete fucking idiot, allows the United States and, its allies to build a massive, massive army directly opposing him across the Iraqi/Kuwaitian border to the Saudi border, like a complete and absolute idiot. The irony is, Saddam could have actually technically, before Desert Shield happened, he could have probably invaded and conquered large ports, or if not outright Saudi Arabia. Now, obviously, that would have led to the United States intervening, but probably much more hastily, and the United States would have taken a lot more casualties. But, I don't know, maybe they would have directly wiped out Saddam there. Anyway, so he literally sits there like a sitting duck while the U.S. builds up one of the biggest militaries in standing armies in world history. And his strategy to defeat this coalition, which includes Arab states, is to attack Israel using Scuds to try and get Israel to declare war on... So he's trying to get Israel to declare war or go to war against him so that the Arabs will be more sympathetic with him as opposed to Israel and the U.S. So that doesn't work. Then the U.S. built up one of the biggest armies in history of all these people that were prepared to go to the now ending Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Fulda Gap in West Germany. And they move everything down there from the Fulda Gap now because the Soviet Union is... All of the Warsaw Pact is collapsed. The Soviet Union is in complete collapse. I've talked about this in Collapse, and I'll make more episodes of Collapse. I'm sorry it's been such a long hiatus. So the Soviet military is literally being directly unpaid. Soviet states are directly starting to leave, declare their independence, declare their autonomy from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is in complete collapse by this time in 1991. And so the U.S. has a complete free hand to use all its stockpiles from the Cold War, late Cold War, Reagan's second Cold War, if you will. And they just empty themselves on this horrible, stupid Arab army. I'm not a Muslim, but I'm not racist against Arabs. I don't want to be overly racist against Arabs here, but it's well known that Arabs do not have effective field armies, and Saddam wasn't any different. Saddam's army, the Iraqi army, is annihilated, and the U.S. retakes Kuwait and leaves Saddam in place with some minor air support attacking him and harassing him after the war. And they enact the no-fly zone with Air Force harassment of Iraq until the Second Iraq War. So anyway, this is a very, very, very resounding U.S. victory. And the reason for that is very, very clear operational goals. They did not attempt to invade Iraq. They simply pushed him out of Iraq in conjunction with what the UN would want, unlike the Korean War, where they attempted to conquer North Korea and have the Republic of Korea annex the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Here, they simply kick the Iraqi army back out into Iraq and reestablish the Kingdom of Kuwait and destroy the false government, the occupation government, the Republic of Kuwait. So then you have the no-fly zone, where the U.S. and NATO and its allies harass Iraq until the Second Iraq War, which you should probably count as a war. This is really confusing humanitarian bullshit in Somalia, which is a failure. And then the U.S., because when you go into Clinton, and I talked about this before, is when Clinton does an intervention, he picks a very small intervention, but he's very humanitarian, and he tries to make himself... the irony is Clinton's really smart. Hillary, not so much, but Bill, he's pretty smart. So he always picks these battles. They're very humanitarian and very glamorous to the liberal media, but it's not going to lose a lot of troops. And so he has this ideology, the peak of neoliberalism, the end of history. China's not powerful enough to exert its influence outside, and Russia is a step away from dissolving into a civil war after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Yugoslavian Civil War, which you should call the Yugoslavian Civil War, is being waged against the Muslims, or the Bosniak Muslims. I'm not going to call them Bosnians, because that's extremely biased. The Serbians and the Croatians. At the beginning, Germany wants to ally the Croatians, right? Germany, I don't know, for some reason they always like Croatians. So anyway, Serbia is winning this war, And Serbia is trying to negotiate a way out. Originally, the Serbians kind of wanted to maintain Yugoslavia. They keep the name of Yugoslavia, but eventually it breaks out into this civil war with like these proxy armies, which are Serbia, but not directly controlled by Serbia, which is still called Yugoslavia, within Bosnian and Croatian civil wars. And Serbia is trying to negotiate with Croatia an end to this war by basically agreeing to a partition of Bosnia, and that the Bosniak Muslims won't get their own country. And guess what? Clinton intervenes on the side of not necessarily Croatia, but the Bosniak Muslims against Serbia. It makes up all these bizarre atrocities, or very, very exaggerated atrocities that Serbia supposedly did. Bombed Serbia in alliance with these Bosniak Muslims who are being illegally supported by Pakistan. And leads to Serbia being defeated and Yugoslavia permanently divided and weak. So then there's a second Yugoslav war, the Kosovo War, where Albanian Kosovonians revolt against the Serbians, and the United States allies with the NATO, again Muslim, allies with the Kosovonian Albanians against Serbia, and directly bombs Serbia and leads to the pseudo-state of Kosovo, which is, to this day, I believe, is still occupied by the United States and NATO. And you know what's kind of interesting here is we're going to go into Operation Uphold Democracy, and Clinton becomes very smart here. To do regime change in Panama or in Dominican Republic, the United States directly invaded Dominican Republic in 1965 and directly invaded Panama in 1989. Clinton, to do regime change of the military dictator in Haiti, talks a lot and threatens to invade but never actually invades, and that's Operation Uphold Democracy. So it didn't even lead to a direct war. So that is massive U.S. victory because the U.S. didn't even really invade. So obviously Clinton gets a U.S. victory there, and then we go back. Both the Yugoslav wars obviously are U.S. victories. Regardless if I would have supported those, which I do not in the slightest support those two wars. So at this point, Al-Qaeda is, in a certain point, in a war with the United States. It bombs the U.S. embassies, it attacks the USS Cole. The United States responds with Operation Infinite Reach, which doesn't go very well. They bomb Sudan, they bomb Afghanistan. It doesn't lead anywhere. The Taliban ascend to the most powerful faction in Afghanistan. The civil war never really ends. The Northern Alliance retreats to the north of the country, obviously, hence Northern Alliance. So anyway, what happens after that? Right, 9/11 happens. And I'm not going to get really far into the weeds with 9/11 conspiracy theories here because that's not really the point. So anyway, the United States invades Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban in alliance with the Northern Alliance and chase out Saddam Hussein, or what the fuck is happening? Just chase out Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda goes into Pakistan, a nuclear state, and sits there, and this leads to the Northwest Pakistan conflict, which to a certain extent continues this day, but it got more intense. I think at one point it was more intense than the actual Afghan war, but it's de-escalated somewhat since then, and Afghanistan is more escalating now. So anyway, the Afghan war, huge U.S. failure, because they have no plan whatsoever. They didn't just intervene and put the Northern Alliance power. That probably would have been, the best choice. They attempt to create a democracy in Afghanistan, which will not work because Afghanistan is a tribal society with multiple ethnicities. U.S. is a foreign power, and they've been in a civil war since 1978 at this point. So the U.S., instead of admitting defeat, has stayed within the country for about 19 years now. and is currently in negotiations with the Taliban for a peace treaty, which means the United States would essentially admit defeat. The United States had no plan whatsoever. They just stayed there and then just stayed there, so they would never have to admit defeat. Now we'll go back into the conspiracy theory. It's very possible, because the United States did this in Vietnam, in the Golden Triangle there, that they are shipping heroin and controlling the heroin trade in Afghanistan. The CIA is doing that. And that's the real reason why the United States stays in Afghanistan, and very, very, very deep conspiracy. The reason why 9/11 happened and why they're there still. Now, that's a very common conspiracy theory. Definitely smarter than believing that the lizard people are actual lizards. But it's not exactly official history. But the U.S.-Afghanistan war was a massive failure. Let's go to the Iraq war. So the Bush regime says that Saddam Hussein is developing weapons of mass destruction, and that they directly say that Iraq supported Al-Qaeda. People forget that the Bush presidency literally told the American people that the Ba'athist regime in Iraq supported Al-Qaeda. So, and people say blood for oil. I really think that it was George Bush disapproved of the war in the Gulf War and wanted to finish it out. So anyway, the irony is the United States completely destroys Saddam Hussein, has no clear idea, and tries to put a multi-party democracy there. What ends up happening then is a civil war where the U.S. sits by and just watches it. The U.S. has very restrained, because a very exaggerated definition of war crimes. Anything the U.S. would do is a war crime in the war. The U.S. sits there, does nothing while the country tears itself apart, and then Bush leaves the presidency. He does the surge, which, restrains the bloodshed. Obama takes the presidency and basically pays off the Sunnis. He pays off the Sunnis so that the war will end for the near-term future, and just leaves. And then the Sunnis, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was formed after the U.S. invaded Iraq, because there were no direct links between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was trained but initially directly defeated in 2004, 2005 by the U.S. They're still very hardcore, very well-trained veterans. And then they become one party of Mujahideen in Syria. But they're very well trained, very experienced, very good veterans, and they slowly build themselves up into becoming ISIS. ISIS becomes one faction, maybe not as big as a faction as you'd think. In Syria, it's kind of exaggerated because they're very rural parts. So anyway, ISIS invades the western part of Iraq. The Sunni parts rapidly takes it over. The very weak and crippled and bribe-heavy, horrible Arab military of the Iraqis collapses. And the U.S. is forced into intervening yet again in Iraq in a third Iraq war, maybe fourth if you count the Iran-Iraq war that the U.S. has been in. Of course, the U.S. defeats ISIS, but now Iraq has no stable government. They want U.S. troops out immediately, any government they have. I think the Sunnis have, no representation. They've basically been expelled from the country, and they're refugees everywhere else, the native Sunni Iraqis. The Shia have become a super majority, 80% of people outside of the Kurds of Iraqis. So you have a bunch of Kurdish militias in a Kurdistan that's basically de facto independent, and you have a puppet state of Iraq, which is run by, just like Lebanon with the Hezbollah, is run by all these Iraqi Shia militias, which are directly allied with Iran. And the U.S. is quasi-allied with the official government, which, like the official government of Lebanon, is powerless, and the real power is led by all these Shia militias, which are directly allied with Iran. So, technically speaking, the U.S. won, but Iraq is now almost a quasi puppet because it's so weird because how the militia system works there. Weird because it's not a modern nation state. Historically, not very weird, right? But anyway, Pyrrhic victory. Iraq War and Second Iraq War. You could call them the same conflict, but Pyrrhic victory for the U.S. because the U.S. government is technically still there, but really isn't. So anyway, it's really a fictional thing that exists on paper, and what controls the country is Shia militias. So anyway, the U.S. also intervenes against ISIS, but is positioning troops against Russia in the Second Cold War, Third Cold War, whatever the fuck you want to call. Putin is the Antichrist, Red Scare, or whatever the fuck this is. So now U.S. troops are positioned that were doing these special operations missions into Syria against ISIS, but are also positioning against the Assad presidency, the Assad Syria, the official government of Syria, the legal government of Syria. So they have all these troops that are still sitting there positioned as in small special forces troops that are positioned to attack Syria, the official government of Syria, and preventing the Syrian civil war from ending. And the United States intervenes in Syria in direct alliance because they can't directly align themselves with the moderate Al-Qaeda, basically. The breakoffs of Al-Qaeda, moderate Al-Qaeda. They can't directly be their allies. They can indirectly be their allies against ISIS and Assad, because moderate Al-Qaeda is better than ISIS and moderate Al-Qaeda is better than Assad. But so the only thing that they can ally with themselves is with Syrian Kurdistan, which is its own player in this, which is a direct enemy and harbinger of Turkish terrorists that attack civilians in Turkey. So the United States has destroyed probably strategically most important alliance, the alliance which definitely is the greatest threat to Russia, and the greatest check on Russia, which the United States says is its greatest strategic enemy, at least until the coronavirus happened, Russia. So the United States is basically, on behest of Israel, which is allied with Syrian Kurdistan against Assad, destroyed its most important strategic alliance in the Syrian civil war. So that's still going on. I can't really say win or defeat. But the take through is, outside of Vietnam and, I guess the Lebanese intervention in 1982, every single one of these basically is a U.S. victory. U.S., when it has a president, Reagan, the first Bush, and Clinton, that pick its battles very well, it usually wins. But when it has somebody like Obama and Bush, they're picking really bad battles, especially Obama, because I didn't want to include them here, but Obama mismanaged Iraq, right? He led to ISIS invading in Iraq, becoming this puppet country, and he didn't really directly intervene in Libya, right? He very indirectly intervened and led to complete chaos in Libya, and led Libya into basically becoming a permanent civil war state like the Congo or Somalia now for the last 9 years. So Obama's strategy is very indirect, Clinton-esque, but very, very poorly done interventions. So there you go. The takeaway again is well-planned operations that the United States has done succeed. The United States always holds back its power, even in the Vietnam War where it could have won. So the U.S. generally has been operationally very good. But, when they don't plan things out, it turns pretty poorly. Anyway, thanks for letting me have a ramble that isn't the coronavirus or isn't me playing video games. So see you guys.